January 17th, 1945. The dense fog of the Ardennes clung to the forested hills, muffling the rumble of engines and the distant thud of artillery. German Panzer IVs and Panthers crept along narrow roads, their crews tense, confident in their armor, certain that no Allied weapon could pierce their steel. The air smelled of damp earth and burning fuel, punctuated by the acrid smoke of recent skirmishes. Soldiers whispered prayers, checking gauges and peering through periscopes, unaware that a new threat awaited them. Hidden among the folds of the terrain, American tank destroyers crouched like predators, their long 90mm guns aimed with lethal precision. A sudden volley shattered the quiet. The first Panther was hit, its armor shredded, and the crew scrambled in disbelief. Shock spread through the German ranks as more tanks fell under the unseen American fire, each impact echoing like a verdict of inevitability. What had been expected to be a routine advance turned into a nightmare. The commander's confidence cracked with every report, every destroyed machine, and in that frozen forest, a lesson in modern armored warfare was about to be written in blood. By late 1944, the war in Europe had reached a critical juncture. The Allies had landed in Normandy months earlier, pushing German forces steadily eastward. The front lines stretched across France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, a tangle of forests, rivers, and towns still scarred by months of fighting. German armored units, long the pride of the Wehrmacht, were confident in their ability to repel the advancing Allied armies. Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs dominated the battlefield in both reputation and physical presence. Their crews, rigorously trained and battle-hardened, believed in the superiority of their tanks. They had been taught that German engineering and firepower could overcome any foe, and that Allied armor, no matter how numerous, lacked the penetration and speed to challenge them directly. This belief, however, was about to face a stark test. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Army had been rethinking armored warfare since the early years of the conflict. American doctrine emphasized mobility, flexibility, and concentrated firepower. Unlike the Germans, who deployed tanks to punch through enemy lines, the United States focused on specialized units designed to destroy enemy armor rather than hold territory. The Tank Destroyer Force, created in 1941, was an embodiment of this philosophy. Equipped with high-velocity guns and lighter, faster chassis, these vehicles were designed to hunt tanks rather than slug it out in prolonged engagements. Initial skepticism from Allied commanders gave way to cautious optimism as prototypes proved their effectiveness in training exercises, showing that American crews could hit moving targets at ranges that would challenge even the most seasoned German gunners. Production ramped up rapidly. By 1944, models like the M10 Wolverine, M18 Hellcat, and the newer M36 Jackson entered European theaters, each armed with guns capable of penetrating the thickest German armor at practical combat ranges. The M36, in particular, carried a 90mm high-velocity cannon that could pierce Panther frontal armor at 1,000 yards, a feat German tank crews did not anticipate. Meanwhile, logistical and strategic planning ensured these tank destroyers could be deployed precisely where they were needed, exploiting terrain and intelligence to maximize their lethality. Reports from early encounters in Normandy hinted at their potential, but the scale of their effectiveness was yet to be fully realized. German commanders, confident in their superiority, had continued to rely on established tactics. Panthers would advance in coordinated platoons, Tigers would anchor defensive positions, and Panzer P4s would provide support where needed. They assumed Allied armor could be met with frontal engagements, their heavy guns and armor giving them a decisive advantage. Yet, the Americans had studied these tactics and devised countermeasures that emphasized ambushes, flanking, and rapid repositioning. U.S. tank destroyer crews trained to strike from concealed positions, taking advantage of terrain and surprise. In practice, this meant that forests, ridges, and small villages could conceal vehicles that, until recently, German commanders assumed posed no serious threat. The contrast in doctrine also extended to human factors. German tank crews were accustomed to a hierarchy that emphasized coordination, discipline, and mutual support. Orders were strict, and improvisation on the battlefield was limited. American crews, in contrast, enjoyed a degree of autonomy that allowed rapid decisions in high-pressure situations. This flexibility, combined with superior firepower in the form of 90mm guns, created a tactical advantage that the Germans had not anticipated. When the first reports reached German units of Panther and Tiger tanks being destroyed at ranges previously considered safe, disbelief and frustration followed. Men who had survived countless battles now faced a weapon that disrupted every expectation, undermined every tactic, and rendered their most trusted machines vulnerable. By the time the Allies reached the dense forests of the Ardennes and the hills of Lorraine, the tank destroyer force had matured into a disciplined, lethal instrument of war. Its crews were adept at reading terrain, identifying German weaknesses, and striking with precision before fading back into cover. In many ways, this represented the culmination of American armored doctrine. Speed, firepower, and tactical intelligence combined to level the playing field against Germany's traditionally superior tanks. For German commanders, who had relied on mechanical superiority as much as human skill, the emergence of these high-velocity tank destroyers in two reduced a threat that was neither expected nor easily countered. The stage was set for confrontations that would redefine armored warfare, exposing vulnerabilities that would shock even the most seasoned German officers. The German reliance on traditional armor superiority and the Americans' innovative approach would soon collide on the battlefield, with consequences that neither side could ignore. The first encounters would teach lessons in firepower, mobility, and tactical thinking that would echo across Europe. The initial encounters between German tanks and American tank destroyers were subtle, almost unremarkable, but they carried the seeds of a profound shift in battlefield dynamics. During the Normandy breakout in the summer of 1944, U.S. forces began to employ tank destroyers systematically. M10s and M18s, agile and fast, moved along secondary roads and forest edges, striking German armor from unexpected angles. Panthers and Tigers, though formidable, found themselves under fire from weapons they had previously underestimated. Reports filtered back to German command. Their tanks were being penetrated at distances once considered safe. Crews were being neutralized before they could return effective fire, and formations were being disrupted without warning. What had been assumed to be a localized threat now hinted at a broader systemic challenge. As the Allies pressed through France and entered Belgium, the tactical reality became more pronounced. The Battle of the Ardennes, which would later become infamous as the Battle of the Bulge, showcased the deadly effectiveness of these American vehicles. Tank destroyers were deployed in forests, on ridges, and along choke points, allowing relatively small units to halt or slow German armored advances. The high-velocity 90mm guns could punch through Panther frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards, giving crews a wind, how to engage and destroy before the enemy even fully recognized their presence. For German commanders, accustomed to the dominance of their tanks at medium ranges, this was disorienting. Every new report seemed to defy their expectations, eroding the confidence that had carried them through years of conflict. Human factors magnified the impact. German tank crews, trained for aggressive maneuvers and frontal assaults, were now confronted with unseen threats, hidden in terrain that had once offered security. The sudden lethality of tank destroyers sowed fear and hesitation. Panthers advancing along narrow roads could be stopped in their tracks by a single well-placed shot. German officers tried to adapt by sending scouts ahead or repositioning heavier tanks to guard likely ambush sites, but American crews were mobile, unpredictable, and disciplined. The psychological toll was evident. Hesitation in attack formations, miscommunication between units, and growing caution in what had been routine operations. Reports from survivors describe a sense of disbelief, the shock of seeing tanks penetrate what had been considered invulnerable armor, and the grim realization that every advance now carried unseen risk. On the Allied side, this period highlighted the effectiveness of doctrine, planning, and industrial capacity. U.S. forces could field sufficient numbers of tank destroyers to cover multiple sectors, allowing the enemy to be engaged simultaneously in different regions. Crews understood that their vehicles, while lighter and less armored than Panthers or Tigers, had a tactical edge that demanded initiative, positioning, and precise marksmanship. Coordination with infantry, artillery, and reconnaissance units amplified their impact, enabling ambushes and rapid strikes. Across multiple engagements, a pattern emerged. German armored superiority, while still formidable on paper, could be neutralized by careful deployment of mobility and firepower. By late 1944, German commanders had begun to notice the trend. Casualty reports, disrupted advances, and battlefield debriefings painted a picture of an enemy who had learned to exploit the very strengths that the Germans had long considered unassailable. Panthers and Tigers no longer guaranteed dominance. Their crews faced weapons that could outrange them, strike with deadly precision, and disappear before retaliation was possible. The reality of armored warfare had shifted, and the introduction of the 90mm high-velocity gun mounted on American tank destroyers was at the center of this transformation. This weapon was more than just steel and gunpowder. It symbolized a new era of mobility, firepower, and tactical ingenuity that the Germans had not anticipated. The stage was set for confrontation. German confidence, built over years of success with heavy armor, now faced the practical consequences of an enemy who had studied, adapted, and innovated. The next engagements would not only test technology, but also human resilience, tactical flexibility, and the limits of doctrine under fire. The lessons learned in these clashes would reverberate across the final months of the European campaign. The first angle to consider is the tactical impact of the American tank destroyers. On the battlefield, mobility and positioning were as important as firepower, and the U.S. doctrine emphasized exploiting both. Unlike traditional tank engagements, where the heaviest armor led the assault, tank destroyers were used to anticipate enemy movements, strike with precision, and then relocate before retaliation could occur. In forests, villages, and along ridgelines, a single M36 could halt the advance of multiple Panthers, forcing German commanders to rethink formations that had once been considered invincible. The high-velocity 90mm gun allowed for direct hits on frontal armor, a vulnerability that German crews had long believed was nearly impervious. Ambushes became the standard tactic. The Americans understood that surprise was a force multiplier. They would position their vehicles in concealed locations, allowing for devastating first strikes that often determined the outcome of an engagement before the enemy could respond. German commanders quickly realized that their traditional reliance on frontal armor and coordinated assaults could no longer guarantee success. What had once been an expected dominance of battlefield engagements now required caution, adaptability, and constant reconnaissance. From a technological perspective, the 90mm high-velocity gun represented a leap forward in armored warfare. Its muzzle velocity, armor-piercing capabilities, and precision gave tank destroyer crews the ability to engage enemy armor at ranges that German commanders had considered safe. Panthers and even early Tigers, with their thick frontal plating, were suddenly vulnerable from distances where return fire was ineffective or impossible. The engineering behind the gun allowed for flatter trajectories, minimizing the chance for shells to ricochet or fail to penetrate. Meanwhile, the tank destroyer chassis, while lighter and more vulnerable, emphasized speed and agility, allowing crews to select firing positions rapidly, disengage under fire, and redeploy to exploit weaknesses in German formations. The combination of firepower and mobility meant that a single vehicle could influence the outcome of an entire sector, especially when used in coordination with reconnaissance units and infantry support. This technological edge forced the Germans into defensive postures and limited their tactical options. The human perspective adds another layer to this transformation. German tank crews, who had trained for years to operate the Panther or Tiger as near unstoppable machines, were unprepared for the shock of these new encounters. Reports from survivors described disbelief at seeing their tanks disabled from what seemed impossible ranges. Panic sometimes set in when a single well-placed shot destroyed the lead vehicle in a column, halting momentum and exposing following tanks to further attacks. Fear and uncertainty began to ripple through crews, leading to hesitation, mistakes, and breakdowns in coordination. The Americans, in contrast, relied on smaller crews who could communicate quickly and adapt to the flow of combat. The psychological advantage of the tank destroyer's unexpected lethality became as important as the physical threat itself. German officers had to contend not only with material losses, but also with the erosion of morale and the mounting anxiety of encountering an enemy they had underestimated. Leadership decisions were tested in real time as commanders attempted to adjust. Some German officers ordered changes in formation, placing heavier tanks in advance, or attempting to concentrate fire on suspected tank destroyer positions. Others tried to use artillery to neutralize threats before they could strike. Despite these efforts, the Americans had anticipated many of these adjustments, using mobility and terrain to mitigate concentrated fire. Leadership became a race between adaptation and reaction, with German officers often forced to respond to conditions rather than impose control. Commanders faced the dilemma of risking entire armored units in traditional maneuvers or slowing advances to mitigate losses, either choice carrying strategic and psychological costs. Finally, the enemy and moral angle highlighted the unexpected consequences. The sudden appearance of tank destroyers armed with high-velocity 90mm guns altered not just tactics, but the very perception of armored warfare. German soldiers began to question the invincibility of their machines, realizing that technological superiority could be offset by innovation, planning, and adaptability. The moral shock was profound. What had been a predictable battlefield now held an unseen deadly force, capable of striking decisively before countermeasures could be deployed. This combination of tactical, technological, human, and leadership factors meant that the tank destroyers were more than vehicles. They were instruments of disruption, rewriting the rules of engagement in a war that had long relied on heavy armor dominance. The consequences of these angles converged on the battlefield, shaping each engagement, each advance, and each decision. The Germans, confronted with an enemy capable of precise, high-impact strikes from unexpected positions, faced a paradigm shift in armored combat. It was a lesson learned in blood and fire, one that would define the final months of the European campaign and leave a lasting imprint on military thinking. The technological surprise of American tank destroyers was only part of the story. In practice, the operational angle revealed how doctrine and coordination magnified their impact. Tank destroyers were rarely deployed in isolation. U.S. commanders integrated them with infantry, artillery, and reconnaissance units, creating a combined arms network that allowed rapid engagement and withdrawal. Reconnaissance teams scouted German positions and relayed coordinates, while artillery softened or distracted enemy armor, leaving them vulnerable to the precise strikes of the 90mm gun. The result was an operational synergy the Germans had not anticipated. A single ambush could delay an entire armored column, force rerouting, or create chaos in what had been a tightly organized advance. German officers quickly recognized that success now depended not only on the quality of their tanks, but also on their ability to adapt to a battlefield that no longer followed predictable patterns. From a leadership perspective, German commanders faced unprecedented challenges. They had long relied on heavy tanks as the backbone of both offensive and defensive operations. The Panther, in particular, was considered the ultimate armored weapon, capable of long-range engagements and withstanding significant punishment. When reports arrived of Panthers being destroyed by high-velocity 90mm rounds, skepticism gave way to disbelief, and disbelief quickly became alarm. Commanders had to revise tactics on the fly, dispersing units, altering supply lines, and reconsidering how to counter a foe whose firepower exceeded their expectations. Orders were often reactive, issued in response to losses rather than as part of a coherent plan. The leadership strain was compounded by the psychological toll on crews whose confidence in their machines had been shaken. Every encounter required careful coordination and improvisation, a departure from the doctrinal certainty they had relied on throughout the war. The human angle deepened the story further. Soldiers who had survived multiple engagements found themselves facing a weapon that changed the rules of survival. Accounts from German tank crews described the shock of seeing their lead tanks destroyed from impossible distances, the sudden panic that spread through formations, and the desperate scramble to regroup. Crew members reported a growing fear of the terrain itself. Forests, hills, and villages that once offered cover now concealed unseen threats. The psychological impact was profound, undermining initiative and sapping morale. Conversely, American crews experienced confidence tempered by discipline. Their training emphasized precision, stealth, and rapid movement, making them effective even against numerically superior forces. This contrast in human experience shaped the flow of battles, where initiative, perception, and adaptability became as critical as the raw firepower of the tanks themselves. The moral dimension of these encounters cannot be overlooked. German soldiers had been conditioned to believe in the superiority of their armor and the invincibility of the Panther and Tiger. The arrival of high-velocity 90mm guns shattered that belief. Fear, uncertainty, and the sudden awareness of vulnerability altered decisions on the battlefield. Some officers hesitated to commit units fully, others overcompensated with reckless maneuvers, and countless soldiers internalized a grim realization: technological advantage could no longer guarantee survival. Morale, often underestimated in discussions of armored warfare, became a decisive factor. The Americans, by contrast, drew confidence from their preparation, training, and the reliability of their doctrine. This asymmetry in psychological readiness amplified the material effectiveness of tank destroyers. The enemy angle highlights a broader strategic consequence. German forces, accustomed to dominating engagements through armor and concentrated fire, now faced an opponent who could inflict disproportionate damage with fewer resources. Tactical reserves were insufficient to counter the flexibility and reach of American units. Entire sectors that had been considered secure became vulnerable, forcing redistribution of troops and vehicles, delaying offensives, and compromising objectives. The 90mm gun was not simply a weapon. It was a catalyst that forced the Germans to rethink the very way they fought. German doctrine, previously built on assumptions of armored invincibility, encountered a reality where surprise, speed, and precision could dictate outcomes. Finally, the technological, human, tactical, and moral dimensions intersected to produce a cumulative effect that redefined armored warfare in the final months of the European campaign. Engagements that might once have been decided by armor thickness and frontal assay, were now determined by positioning, initiative, and reaction to an unseen, highly mobile threat. The German High Command struggled to reconcile doctrine with reality, adapting in piecemeal fashion while facing continuous setbacks. On the other hand, American forces leveraged doctrine, technology, and training to maximum effect, transforming tank destroyers into a force multiplier. What had begun as a tactical innovation became, in practice, a decisive element that reshaped the battlefield, forcing both sides to confront the evolving nature of war. The cumulative lessons of these angles, tactical, technological, human, leadership, enemy, and moral, converged in every encounter. Each battle highlighted the interplay of preparation, surprise, and adaptability, producing outcomes that neither side had fully anticipated. German commanders, confronted with a weapon that combined firepower and mobility in ways they could not easily counter, faced the unraveling of traditional assumptions. American tank destroyers had proven themselves not merely as vehicles, but as instruments of transformation, rewriting the rules of armored warfare and setting the stage for the decisive confrontations that would follow. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, blanketed in snow and fog, became the stage for one of the most intense clashes of the war. German forces, confident in the destructive power of their Panthers and Tigers, launched a surprise offensive designed to split Allied lines and seize key supply routes. For weeks, their planning had assumed that American armor would be overwhelmed by the sheer weight of German firepower. The initial stages seemed to confirm this. Columns of tanks moved rapidly through the dense terrain, infantry advancing behind in cautious support. But what the German commanders did not fully anticipate was the hidden network of American tank destroyers lying in wait. M36s, positioned along ridges and in concealed hollows, aimed their 90mm guns at the advancing Germans. The first shots rang out with a sudden, shattering precision, puncturing the front armor of Panthers that had been thought invulnerable. Crew members scrambled, smoke and fire engulfing the lead tanks as the column faltered. Shock rippled through the German command structure. Reports from field officers described confusion and disbelief, their confidence in machine and doctrine shaken by the destructive efficiency of these unseen weapons. The 90mm shells tore through frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, distances at which German gunners had assumed safety. Panthers attempting to maneuver or flank were cut down before they could respond, and Tigers, slower and heavier, became prime targets. The battlefield's chaos intensified as tanks collided, stalled, and caught fire, leaving infantry exposed and forcing immediate tactical recalculations. American tank destroyer crews operated with clinical precision. Using terrain to their advantage, they engaged targets sequentially, focusing on the lead vehicles to disrupt formations. Forested roads and small villages concealed their positions, allowing for repeated ambushes. Artillery support and reconnaissance coordination amplified the effect, ensuring that German columns could not simply charge through with impunity. Every successful strike reinforced the psychological impact, turning shock into hesitation. German commanders ordered concentrated fire against suspected positions, but the mobility and dispersion of the tank destroyers meant that counterattacks were often ineffective. The very doctrines that had carried German armor to repeated victories now seemed inadequate in the face of a weapon system that combined firepower, mobility, and tactical ingenuity. By December 18th, the situation had escalated into sustained attrition. Entire battalions of Panthers found themselves neutralized or forced to retreat. The high-velocity 90mm gun had demonstrated not only the capability to destroy individual tanks, but also to dictate the tempo of battle. German units, unprepared for this level of precision and reach, began to disperse, losing cohesion. Orders became reactive, issued in response to losses rather than as part of a coordinated strategy. Commanders were forced to make on-the-spot decisions, often under the pressure of artillery fire, infantry engagement, and the unpredictable mobility of the American tank destroyers. Reports describe officers resorting to desperate measures, splitting formations, ordering counterattacks in small groups, and attempting to outflank positions that no longer offered predictable advantage. Each maneuver was met with lethal efficiency by the Americans, who had learned to exploit every German misstep. The human cost of this engagement was stark. Crew members of German tanks who had survived multiple previous battles now faced destruction from distances they believed secure. Panic spread in columns where one vehicle's destruction created bottlenecks, leaving subsequent tanks exposed. Accounts from survivors describe the sudden transition from confidence to fear, from routine maneuver to chaotic survival. Smoke, flame, and the cries of the wounded filled the Ardennes, painting a vivid portrait of the psychological impact of these encounters. At the same time, American crews exhibited a disciplined composure, moving from firing position to firing position, striking and disappearing before the enemy could mount an effective response. The contrast in morale became as decisive as the firepower itself. As the engagement reached its peak, it became clear that the German offensive had stalled. What was intended as a breakthrough was reduced to sporadic clashes, ambushes, and desperate attempts to maintain momentum. The high-velocity 90mm gun, mounted on a lightly armored but mobile chassis, had transformed the battlefield, exposing vulnerabilities in German doctrine and disrupting their operational tempo. Commanders on both sides began to grasp the broader significance. The era of traditional armored dominance was over, replaced by a dynamic environment where mobility, precision, and tactical innovation dictated outcomes. By the close of December 18th, the Ardennes had proven the decisive potential of American tank destroyers. German tank units were reduced, formations broken, and morale shaken. The battlefield was no longer a predictable environment dominated by steel and doctrine, but a domain where initiative, positioning, and adaptation determined survival. The Ardennes was the crucible in which the full capabilities of the 90mm gun and its crews had been revealed, setting the stage for subsequent engagements that would continue to redefine armored warfare in Europe. The confrontation had reached its turning point. German commanders, once confident in their armored superiority, were forced to acknowledge a new reality. The lessons of the Ardennes would resonate beyond these snowy forests, shaping tactics, doctrine, and perceptions across the European theater. What had begun as an offensive designed to exploit perceived weaknesses in Allied defenses had instead exposed the vulnerabilities of the German armored force itself. In the days following the initial engagements in the Ardennes, the full impact of American tank destroyers became undeniable. German commanders, facing mounting losses, attempted to regroup and counterattack, but the battlefield had already shifted beneath them. Panthers and Tigers, once symbols of invincibility, now advanced with extreme caution, their crews haunted by the unseen threat of 90mm guns. Reports from officers describe a growing sense of paranoia. Every forested ridge, village, or road bend was considered a potential ambush site. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion as units were forced to disperse, avoid choke points, and adapt to an enemy whose tactics combined precision, mobility, and calculated unpredictability. The Ardennes had exposed a tactical vulnerability that no amount of armored superiority could immediately rectify. By December 19th, engagements had evolved into a relentless series of encounters where American tank destroyers dictated the tempo. M36 Jacksons and M18 Hellcats struck from concealed positions, taking advantage of range, speed, and terrain. Panthers that attempted frontal assaults were destroyed before closing distance, while Tigers, slower and heavier, were targeted in flanking maneuvers or caught in crossfire. The psychological effect on German crews was profound. Hesitation replaced aggression, and once confident gunners doubted the integrity of their armor. The Americans, in contrast, executed coordinated strikes with methodical precision, demonstrating that careful planning, disciplined training, and technological advantage could outweigh numerical disparity. Each encounter reinforced the lesson that the battlefield now favored adaptability and tactical foresight over brute force. The human toll was severe. German tank crews, accustomed to decisive engagements dominated by their heavy armor, found themselves exposed and vulnerable. Survivors described the terror of seeing lead tanks obliterated by unseen fire, the chaos of stalled formations, and the sudden need to improvise under lethal pressure. Smoke and fire filled the forested roads, punctuated by the anguished cries of the wounded. The unpredictability of the American strikes forced crews into defensive mindsets, reducing initiative and slowing operations. For the first time, confidence in German armored invincibility was replaced with fear, a factor that would continue to influence decisions for the remainder of the Ardennes offensive. Leadership decisions at all levels were tested to their limits. German officers attempted to consolidate positions, redistribute forces, and coordinate artillery support to neutralize the American threat. Yet, each adjustment seemed to be anticipated and countered. The mobility of tank destroyers, combined with their precise firepower, allowed them to evade concentrated fire while continuing to disrupt German advances. Commanders faced the dual pressures of maintaining unit cohesion and protecting the lives of their crews, often having to make impossible choices between engagement and retreat. Every decision carried consequences: delays, losses, or complete operational failure. This high-stakes environment magnified the importance of both initiative and adaptation, qualities the Americans had systematically trained for and the Germans were now forced to improvise. The operational consequences extended beyond immediate losses. German advances stalled across key sectors of the Ardennes, supply lines were disrupted, and coordinated offensives faltered. The 90mm gun had not only destroyed tanks, but had also shattered formations and disrupted timing, creating vulnerabilities that American infantry and artillery exploited. The effectiveness of the tank destroyers forced German commanders to abandon planned offensives, consolidate defensively, and contend with the unpredictability of terrain now dominated by mobile, precise enemy units. Even seasoned commanders acknowledged the changing dynamics. Doctrine that had worked for years was proving insufficient against a weapon system designed to exploit its weaknesses. By December 21st, the culmination of these engagements revealed the decisive turning point. German armored units, depleted and demoralized, could no longer maintain the initiative. The Ardennes offensive, intended to surprise and overwhelm Allied forces, had been blunted by the combination of firepower, mobility, and tactical ingenuity embodied in American tank destroyers. The once dominant Panthers and Tigers, symbols of German armored pride, now represented vulnerability. Commanders reassessed strategy, increasingly favoring caution over aggression, and the operational tempo of the offensive slowed to a near halt. The Ardennes experience demonstrated a fundamental shift in armored warfare. Mobility and surprise, combined with high-velocity firepower, could redefine engagements previously dictated by armor thickness and numerical superiority. German officers faced the harsh reality that technological advantage alone did not guarantee battlefield success. Human factors, morale, perception, and adaptability played as crucial a role as any gun or chassis. The 90mm gun, mounted on agile and disciplined vehicles, had changed the equation. It had neutralized the confidence of elite crews, disrupted command structures, and forced the Germans into reactive strategies, turning planned offensives into a series of desperate, constrained maneuvers. By the end of December 1944, the lessons were clear. The era of predictable armored dominance had ended. The Ardennes had shown that innovation, preparation, and disciplined execution could overcome previously unchallenged machines. German tank commanders, once confident in their invincibility, were confronted with the harsh reality that the battlefield had evolved. The high-velocity 90mm gun was more than a weapon. It was a strategic equalizer, a tool that rewrote expectations and ensured that from this point forward, armored engagements would never be fought the same way again. The aftermath of the Ardennes engagements left German armored units reeling. Panthers and Tigers, which had once been seen as nearly invincible, had suffered losses at rates that commanders struggled to comprehend. Field reports detailed destroyed lead tanks, stalled columns, and disrupted formations, all the result of high-velocity 90mm rounds fired from concealed American tank destroyers. Units that had anticipated straightforward advances found themselves withdrawing under pressure, adjusting formations, and redeploying forces to compensate for losses. The operational consequences extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Supply lines were compromised, infantry support had to adjust, and entire planned offensives were delayed or canceled. The American tank destroyer had not only destroyed machines, but had forced the Germans to rethink the tempo, strategy, and even the fundamental assumptions of armored warfare. Casualties were significant, both material and human. German tanks that had survived previous campaigns were now reduced to charred hulks along frozen roads and wooded hillsides. Crew members were killed, wounded, or captured, their experience and morale shattered by encounters that defied prior expectations. German officers recorded frustration at the inability to predict American positions, often lamenting the loss of experienced gunners and drivers who had once been considered the elite of armored warfare. Every destroyed tank was more than a vehicle. It was a blow to confidence, a visible symbol of the vulnerability that had suddenly emerged in the German force. The impact on morale was immediate and profound. Reports from surviving German soldiers described the disorientation of facing an enemy that could strike from unexpected positions with lethal effect. Hesitation replaced initiative. Where once aggressive maneuvers were routine, caution and uncertain, TIE now dominated. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion and assert control over units, increasingly aware of the lethal reach of American 90mm guns. The psychological effects extended beyond the front lines. High Command received updates that indicated diminished confidence among crews, prompting concern that continued engagements would further erode effectiveness. For the first time, technology and tactical innovation were visibly altering the human dimension of German armored operations. From the American perspective, the engagement validated years of doctrinal development and training. The tank destroyer force had been conceived to counter superior enemy armor, and in practice, it had achieved exactly that. M36 Jacksons, M18 Hellcats, and M10 Wolverines had demonstrated their ability to operate in coordination with infantry and reconnaissance, striking precisely and rapidly before withdrawing to new positions. Casualty reports for American crews, while not insignificant, were far lower than for German tank units, reflecting the effectiveness of mobility, training, and the tactical advantage of surprise. Commanders recognized that the high-velocity 90mm gun was not only capable of neutralizing German heavy armor, but also of reshaping the psychological and operational landscape of the battlefield. Analysis of battle reports revealed patterns that would influence future engagements. German losses were concentrated in areas where tank destroyers could exploit terrain and concealment, emphasizing the importance of reconnaissance, positioning, and coordinated fire. American forces consistently disrupted formations, stalled advances, and forced Germans into reactive maneuvers. Units that attempted traditional frontal assaults faced the highest casualty rates, reinforcing the lesson that mobility, speed, and precise firepower now outweighed brute armor strength. The success of the tank destroyers demonstrated that doctrine, training, and tactical innovation could overcome even seemingly superior machines. Beyond material losses, the Ardennes engagements shifted perceptions of armored warfare. German commanders began to question the assumptions that had underpinned their confidence in tanks like the Panther and Tiger. Technology alone was no longer a guarantee of battlefield success. Human adaptability, doctrine, and surprise could alter outcomes decisively. The high-velocity 90mm gun, mounted on agile platforms, had created a new dynamic. It was not merely a weapon, but a strategic equalizer capable of dictating the flow of engagements. The immediate operational consequences were stark. German advances slowed, planned objectives were missed, and units were forced to adopt defensive postures to mitigate further losses. The Ardennes had shown that American innovation could neutralize previously dominant machines, forcing German forces into reactive strategies and limiting their ability to seize the initiative. The combination of tactical, technological, and human factors ensured that the battlefield had shifted irrevocably, setting the stage for continued American advantage in subsequent confrontations. The long-term consequences of the Ardennes engagements extended far beyond the immediate losses of tanks and crews. German commanders, confronted with the reality of American tank destroyers, were forced to reassess their armored doctrine. Where once Panthers and Tigers could dominate frontal engagements with impunity, they now faced an enemy capable of striking from distances that neutralized their armor advantage. Operational plans that relied on concentrated armored thrusts were no longer viable, and the German High Command recognized that mobility, concealment, and rapid response were now critical elements in any engagement. The lessons of the Ardennes forced a recalibration of tactics, but by late 1944, the strategic situation offered limited opportunities to implement these changes. The Allies maintained the initiative, and the Germans had to adapt under pressure, often improvising in ways that were less effective than systematic planning. Psychological impact compounded the tactical consequences. German crews, once confident in the reliability of their tanks, now faced a persistent, unseen threat. Reports from surviving soldiers describe hesitation during advances, overcautious maneuvers, and growing concern about encountering the 90mm gun in concealed positions. Confidence eroded as formations were repeatedly disrupted, and the knowledge that a single well-aimed shot could destroy a lead tank introduced pervasive anxiety into the battlefield. Commanders attempted to mitigate this through altered formations, additional reconnaissance, and repositioning of heavier tanks to cover potential ambush points. But these measures could not entirely offset the tactical and psychological advantage held by American forces. The human element, long secondary to technology in discussions of armored warfare, emerged as a decisive factor in the Ardennes. Strategically, the effectiveness of American tank destroyers allowed the Allies to maintain momentum during late 1944 and early 1945. The slowing of German advances, the disruption of planned offensives, and the attrition of elite armored units created openings for further Allied operations across Belgium and into the Rhineland. German forces were increasingly forced onto the defensive, reacting to threats rather than imposing them. In operational terms, the presence of high-velocity 90mm guns altered the calculus of battlefield planning. Any offensive now required consideration of unseen, mobile, and lethal enemy units capable of decisive engagement at range. The Ardennes had proven that superior firepower combined with mobility and tactical doctrine could overcome the numerical or qualitative advantages previously held by German armor. Technological lessons were equally significant. The success of the 90mm gun and the vehicles that carried it underscored the importance of combining firepower, mobility, and training. American designers and commanders demonstrated that a lighter, faster platform, armed with a high-velocity weapon, could challenge even the most formidable tanks on the battlefield. The integration of reconnaissance, infantry support, and terrain exploitation amplified this effect. German engineers and commanders could not ignore these lessons. Panther and Tiger design alone could no longer dictate outcomes. The practical implications influenced not only ongoing engagements in Europe, but also post-war thinking about the balance of armor, firepower, and maneuverability. The cumulative effect of these developments reshaped German armored strategy in the final months of the war. Offensives were increasingly cautious, defensive lines were reinforced, and commanders relied on slower, more deliberate movements to mitigate exposure to ambushes. Operational flexibility became critical, yet the time required to adapt was often insufficient. The psychological burden on crews, combined with the technological and tactical advantage of American forces, ensured that German armored units were consistently at a disadvantage. Battles were no longer won by raw firepower alone. They required anticipation, adaptability, and the ability to survive encounters with high-velocity threats capable of reshaping entire engagements. By the close of 1944, the Ardennes had made it unmistakably clear that American innovation had shifted the balance. The high-velocity 90mm gun, mounted on agile tank destroyers, had neutralized the dominance of German heavy armor, disrupted formations, and eroded morale. German commanders faced a transformed battlefield, where mobility, surprise, and tactical ingenuity dictated outcomes as much as the quality of steel and guns. The lessons learned in these engagements would influence both sides, shaping decisions, tactics, and strategies for the final months of the European campaign. The Ardennes had proven that technological advantage alone could not guarantee victory, and that human factors, initiative, discipline, and adaptability, were equally decisive in modern armored warfare. The Ardennes campaign and the encounters between German tanks and American tank destroyers left a profound mark on the history of armored warfare. In the snow-covered forests and narrow roads of Belgium, the theoretical superiority of German heavy tanks met a practical, disciplined force that combined technology, mobility, and tactical ingenuity. The high-velocity 90mm gun was more than a weapon. It was a statement that battlefield assumptions, no matter how long held, could be overturned by preparation, innovation, and precise execution. Panthers and Tigers, once symbols of invincibility, had been exposed as vulnerable, their dominance challenged not by numbers, but by human adaptability and doctrine. These events highlight the critical role of innovation in war. The United States had studied the limitations of traditional armor and developed a force capable of exploiting them. Tank destroyers were not just machines, but instruments of strategic disruption, proving that doctrine and training could amplify technology beyond its raw specifications. German commanders, despite years of experience and elite crews, were forced into reactive strategies, illustrating that confidence in superior hardware could be shattered by unseen threats and well-executed tactics. The psychological dimension of warfare, the fear, hesitation, and disorientation caused by effective surprise, proved as decisive as firepower. The lessons of the Ardennes resonate beyond 1944. They remind us that warfare is not solely about material superiority, but about understanding the interplay of humans, machines, and ideas. The battlefield rewards those who anticipate, adapt, and exploit opportunity. The success of American tank destroyers in neutralizing German armor demonstrates the enduring value of innovation, coordination, and disciplined execution. In these frozen forests, amid smoke and shattered steel, the rules of armored combat were rewritten. History records not only the loss of tanks and lives, but the triumph of foresight, flexibility, and ingenuity. The Ardennes teaches a timeless lesson. In war, as in life, what is expected can be overturned, and the measure of victory often lies in the unseen, decisive details.